The night air pressed heavy against my skin as I stumbled forward, gravel biting into my palms. The highway stretched out in both directions, endless ribbons of black lit only by the occasional streak of headlights far in the distance. I tried to push myself up, but my left arm buckled beneath me. The bone had snapped clean, and the pain was sharp enough to make me gasp. Warm blood trickled down from a gash above my eyebrow, dripping into my mouth, metallic and bitter. I forced my eyes open just in time to see the red taillights of my brother's car disappearing into the darkness. "Stay there. You are nothing." Ethan's voice rang out just before the engine roared and swallowed the sound of his laughter. My brother, the one who was supposed to protect me, had shoved me out of the car as if I were trash. For a moment, I lay flat on the pavement, stunned. The concrete radiated the heat it had absorbed all day, pressing into my back, but my body shook with cold. The realization hit me slowly, like water filling a sinking boat. I had been left behind. I was 20 years old, miles from town, my phone gone, my arm broken. Bleeding on a deserted highway in the middle of the night. I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road, terrified another car would not see me in time. My body dragged against the rough surface, every scrape setting fire to my skin. My breath came ragged, shallow tasting of iron. Somewhere in my mind, a voice whispered that this was how I would die. Alone, abandoned, invisible. My brother's words replayed in my head with every heartbeat. Nothing, nothing, nothing. That was what my family had trained me to believe. My mother's cold dismissals, my father's silence, Ethan's unchecked cruelty. They had all spent years teaching me my life held no weight. Tonight, Ethan had proved it by leaving me broken in the road. I pressed my good hand against the bleeding cut on my forehead, but it kept slipping. Tears blurred my vision, though I told myself it was just the sting of the wound. I could not afford to cry. Crying meant surrender, and surrender meant the end. Somewhere in the distance, a semi-truck groaned across the highway. Its headlights flashed for a moment and then vanished, never seeing me. I could have screamed, but no sound came out. My throat felt locked tight, my voice stolen by shock. Minutes dragged like hours. The night grew colder, the stars sharp above me. I thought of the small dorm room I had left behind at school, of the textbooks stacked neatly on my desk, of the tuition receipt I had tucked carefully in my bag. That money was supposed to secure my future. Instead, it had become the reason Ethan lashed out. He wanted it for his gambling debts, and when I resisted, he showed me what I was worth to him. I closed my eyes and imagined what my mother would say if she knew where I was right now. She would not call the police. She would not demand answers. She would sigh and say I was dramatic, that I should not provoke my brother. My father would not even lift his head from the newspaper. They would all carry on, perhaps even laugh about how easily I bruised, how clumsy I had always been. A shiver tore through me stronger than the pain. I forced myself onto my knees, wobbling one arm limp at my side. The highway stretched empty, merciless. The silence felt like mockery. My chest tightened until I thought it would burst. I screamed, then a raw sound that ripped out of me echoing off the blacktop, but no one answered. Blood dripped onto the pavement, tiny dark circles vanishing into the tar. My vision swam. I thought of all the times I had been invisible in my own house, sitting quietly in the corner while Ethan soaked up praise. I thought of the birthdays they forgot the meals, where my words were cut short, the times I had been told to swallow my protests, because peace was more important than truth. Lying there on the highway, I realized peace had never been the goal. Silence had been. Silence served them, not me. My body sagged, and I pressed my cheek against the rough asphalt, breathing in its dusty heat. I waited for another car, any car, to appear, though part of me wondered if Ethan had left me here, hoping no one would. If this road became my grave, he would never admit to knowing. He would laugh it off as another of my dramas. But fate did not let me die. I felt the ground tremble first, a low vibration beneath my ribs. Then a light broke over the curve of the road, growing brighter, wider, swallowing the night. A truck. I willed myself upright, staggering to my feet, just enough to wave my good arm. My body screamed with pain, but survival screamed louder. The truck slowed brakes, hissing metal groaning. Relief struck me so hard I almost collapsed again. For the first time since Ethan pushed me out of the car, hope burned inside me, weak, fragile, but real. I whispered to myself through cracked lips, "Not tonight. I will not die tonight." The driver's door creaked open and a man's voice called out, I could not answer. My knees buckled and the world tilted. The last thing I saw before darkness pulled me under was the beam of the truck's headlights, warm and blinding against the cold night. I did not die on that highway. I lived. And 5 years later, my brother Ethan would collapse when he saw who stood beside me in court. Long. Before the highway night, I had already been taught that my place in the family was somewhere beneath everyone else, hidden and unwanted. My mother Donna often looked at me with thinly veiled irritation, sighing as if my very existence were an inconvenience. She used to call me the extra mouth, a phrase that clung to me like a stain. Every time she said it, Ethan smirked in triumph, enjoying the reminder that he was cherished while I was disposable. My father, Harold, was no better. He rarely spoke to me at all, his silence more punishing than words. When Ethan bragged about his victories on the basketball court or his friends cheered him for being the life of the party, Harold would beam with pride. But when I came home holding a scholarship certificate, Harold simply nodded without lifting his eyes from the newspaper. Donna's reaction was sharper. She glanced at the paper and muttered, "That's cute, but Ethan is the real success in this family." I learned early on that no matter what I accomplished, it would never be enough to tip the scales against Ethan's privileged position. Gaslighting was their favorite weapon. Whenever Ethan crossed the line, Donna turned it into my fault. If he shoved me against the wall during an argument, she would shake her head and say, "You know how he is, Emma. Don't provoke him." If he stole my belongings or mocked me in front of his friends, Harold would mutter, "Ignore it, stop exaggerating." Every act of cruelty was reframed as my overreaction. I began to question my own sanity, wondering if maybe I truly was too sensitive. Maybe I did provoke him without realizing. That doubt was exactly what they wanted. The financial leash kept me tethered as firmly as any chain. Donna and Harold controlled the bank account that held my tuition money. They insisted on handling the paperwork for my health insurance and housing, reminding me that without their help, I would not survive college. It was not generosity, it was power. They dangled my education like a prize I could lose at any moment if I disobeyed. Ethan knew this too, which is why he felt entitled to dip into the account whenever his gambling debts piled up. The first time I confronted him, he laughed in my face. He told me it was just a loan, that he was my brother, and brothers deserved loyalty. When I protested, Donna scolded me for being selfish. She said, "He's family, Emma. Money comes and goes, but brothers are forever." I wanted to scream that his version of brotherhood felt more like a knife pressed against my ribs. Ethan's sense of entitlement grew bolder with each passing year. He crashed my car once after a night of drinking and left me to handle the insurance claim. Donna brushed it aside with, "Boys will be boys." Harold did not say a word. When I cried in my room later, Ethan slipped a note under my door. It said simply, "You will never be free." That note sat in my desk drawer for months, a private reminder that my prison was not just the house, but the bloodline itself. I often imagined leaving, running away to another state, starting over under a different name. But reality pulled me back. I had no savings, no credit card of my own, no car after Ethan wrecked mine. Every exit had been blocked by careful years of control. Sometimes I thought Aunt Margaret might understand. She had once defied Donna, stood up to her in front of the family. I remembered being 13 at the time, watching the argument unfold at Thanksgiving dinner. Margaret had called out Donna for favoring Ethan, for crushing my spirit. Donna's reply was venomous. She told Margaret she was jealous and bitter. That night, Harold told me never to speak of Margaret again. Soon after, she vanished from our gatherings, erased from the family photo wall as if she had died. It was only much later that I would learn she had simply cut ties for her own survival. At 20, I understood what Margaret must have felt. The isolation, the suffocating weight of always being the one who was wrong. But unlike her, I had not yet found a way out. I swallowed my pain in silence, dragging myself through classes by day and working shifts at the diner by night, always aware that my brother hovered like a storm cloud, waiting for another chance to remind me of my place. The night he took money directly from the tuition account, I knew the storm had broken. The lie that I was safe so long as I obeyed finally collapsed. Ethan was no longer just a bully. He had become a thief of my future. When I tried to stand in his way, his eyes turned cold, sharp, with something more dangerous than arrogance. In that instant, I understood that his cruelty was not childish mischief or sibling rivalry. It was a pattern fed by years of indulgence from our parents, hardened into something that could destroy me. And it nearly did. What happened later on the highway was not a sudden outburst. It was the inevitable conclusion of a lifetime of favoritism, gaslighting, and financial abuse. Every insult, every ignored plea, every stolen chance had been leading to that moment. I was not surprised when Ethan raised his hand to me in the car. I was only surprised at how quickly he decided that leaving me to die would be easier than listening to me resist. That realization would haunt me, but it would also plant the seed of resistance. Because if I was nothing to them, then I had nothing left to lose by breaking free. That was the foundation of the choice I would make. That was the truth that carried me through the night of blood and asphalt and into the years that followed. The night it happened began like any other argument, but spiraled with a speed that left me gasping. I had checked my online banking account in the campus library earlier that day and noticed several $100s missing. It was money I had carefully saved part of the tuition balance I needed for the next semester. My stomach dropped as soon as I saw Ethan's name on the transfer. I knew what it meant. Gambling debts again. He always promised it was the last time. It never was. By the time he picked me up in his car later that evening, my chest was tight with dread. I confronted him as soon as the door shut. Ethan's hands gripped the wheel, his jaw clenching. He said, "You are overreacting. I needed it more than you did. It is just money." I shot back, "It is not just money. It is my education. It is my future. You had no right." His laughter was sharp and cruel, the kind of laugh that cut more than it mocked. He told me I was pathetic for caring so much about school, that no degree would ever make me worth more than him. The car sped faster, headlights slicing through the dark as the highway stretched wide and empty. My heart pounded as I demanded he transfer the money back. He sneered, "Family helps family, Emma. You are family, so you will help me." I said no louder this time, voice shaking but firm. That was when his control snapped. With one hand still on the wheel, he struck me across the face with the back of his other hand. The blow sent sparks through my vision, a metallic taste flooding my mouth. I pressed my palm against my cheek, stunned, but before I could react, he hit me again, this time with his fist. Pain exploded my head, slamming into the side window. The world blurred. I begged him to stop, but he shouted over me, "Shut up! You never know when to stop!" His eyes were wild, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The car swerved slightly before steadying again. I thought maybe it would end there, that he would just scream and threaten until he cooled down like always. I underestimated how far he was willing to go. He pulled over abruptly, tires screeching against gravel. Before I could unbuckle my seatbelt, his hand gripped my arm and yanked me across the seat. My broken cry filled the car as he dragged me toward the open door. His strength overpowered me easily. He shoved me out my body, slamming hard against the asphalt. Pain tore through my shoulder and I screamed as my left arm bent at a sickening angle. Blood from my forehead dripped into my eye, blinding me. I heard the slam of the car door, the rev of the engine. I looked up through watery vision and saw his silhouette framed by the car window. His mouth moved and the words seared into me. "Stay there! You are nothing!" Then the taillights flared red before shrinking into the distance. I was alone. The highway was silent, vast, uncaring. The stars above glittered as if watching with detached amusement. I tried to crawl my fingers clawing at the rough surface, but agony shot up my arm. Each breath was shallow, ragged, filled with iron. My thoughts spun. I thought of the scholarship letter tucked in my drawer, the dreams of becoming a nurse, of helping people. Dreams Ethan had just tried to steal. A buzzing vibration from my pocket startled me. My phone. With trembling fingers, I pulled it out, screen cracked from the fall. A message flashed before the battery died. "Don't be dramatic, you always push him too far." It was from my mother. The final confirmation that even now, bleeding on the pavement, the blame was mine. I dropped the phone bile rising in my throat. The betrayal pressed heavier than the broken bones. If I died here tonight, they would tell the world it was an accident, maybe even my fault. The thought froze me more than the night air. My body curled against the asphalt, shaking. The silence pressed in until it became unbearable. I forced myself to scream, voice hoarse and raw, a sound ripped from the center of my chest. It echoed into the empty road, unanswered. Darkness blurred at the edges of my vision, and for a moment I thought maybe it would be easier to let go, to surrender. But something inside me refused. Survival burned stubbornly. I whispered to myself through split lips, "Not like this. I will not end like this." My eyes locked on the stretch of highway ahead, waiting, praying for headlights. My body ached. My spirit cracked, but deep inside a spark flared. It was the spark that told me this night would not be the end of my story. It would be the beginning dot. The roar of an approaching engine broke through the haze of pain and fear that wrapped around me. I blinked against the brightness of headlights cutting across the dark, my heart leaping with a desperate hope. I pushed my good hand up, waving weakly, terrified the driver would not see me until it was too late. Brakes screeched, and the heavy hiss of air filled the night as a massive truck slowed to a stop just feet away. For a moment, I thought I might collapse again, but a door creaked open and a figure stepped down. A man's voice called, "Hey, are you all right?" Of course I was not, but the sound of another human being, someone who had not abandoned me, nearly undid me. My knees buckled and I crumpled to the pavement, unable to form words. Boots scuffed against the asphalt as the man hurried over. "Jesus, kid, you are hurt bad," he muttered. Strong arms lifted me carefully, steady but urgent. I wanted to resist, to insist I could walk, but the broken scream that tore from my throat betrayed me. He carried me toward the truck, muttering reassurances I barely processed. The cab smelled faintly of diesel and old coffee as he set me gently across the seat. My head lolled, eyes heavy, but I heard him speaking into a radio, calling in an emergency. He pressed a wad of cloth against my bleeding forehead and said, "Stay with me, just stay with me." His name, I later learned, was Mr. Reynolds, a long-haul trucker who had seen enough wrecks to know I was in bad shape. The next stretch of time blurred into a series of jolts and flashes. Sirens wailed in the distance and then closer. Red and blue lights washed over the night as paramedics pulled me from the cab. Hands pressed against wounds, voices asked questions I could not answer. They strapped me to a gurney, the sky wheeling above as they loaded me into an ambulance. Inside the sterile brightness, a paramedic checked my pulse, tapped my cheek gently. "Stay with us, you are going to be all right." My arm throbbed, my head pounded, but the greatest weight sat heavy in my chest. Not one thought of family comforted me. I knew even as I bled they would not come. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and despair. Machines beeped steadily as doctors examined my injuries. A fractured arm, 2 cracked ribs, a concussion, deep lacerations across my forehead and shoulder. They asked what had happened. The truth trembled on my lips, but fear sealed it shut. If I told them Ethan had done this, my parents would shield him and I would be branded a liar. Worse, he might come back to finish what he started. So I whispered accident voice hoarse and watched the doctor scribble it down without question. For days, I lay in that bed, drifting in and out of sleep, haunted by the red taillights vanishing into the night. No one from my family visited, no flowers, no calls, no notes. The silence spoke louder than any denial. They had cast me out completely. Then one evening, as the sun bled orange across the blinds, a woman appeared in the doorway. Her hair was streaked with silver, her shoulders strong despite the years. Aunt Margaret. I had not seen her in nearly a decade, not since the Thanksgiving, when she dared to challenge my mother and was erased from our lives. She looked at me, eyes soft but fierce, and whispered, "Oh, Emma." I did not ask how she knew. She stepped inside, took my uninjured hand, and squeezed. I burst into tears for the first time since the highway. She let me cry, let the floodgates open until exhaustion left me hollow. When I finally stammered that I could not go back, she nodded firmly. "You do not go back. Not ever again." Her words were not suggestion. They were command, a promise. That night she signed the discharge papers and brought me home with her. Her house sat near the ocean, the air heavy with salt and freedom. For the first time in my life, I felt the walls around me did not belong to my jailers. Margaret gave me a bed, fresh clothes, and silence when I needed it most. She never pushed, never demanded explanations. She only said, "You are safe here." Safe. A word I had almost forgotten the taste of. I slept for 2 days straight, waking only to sip water or swallow the pain medicine she left at my side. Each time I drifted off, I repeated her words in my mind. Safe here. When I stepped onto her porch on the 3rd morning, the ocean stretched wide and endless before me. Waves crashed against the rocks, gulls cried overhead. The air smelled of salt and possibility. I breathed deep and told myself the truth for the first time. My brother had tried to erase me, but I was still here. My parents had chosen silence, but I had found a voice waiting in the quiet strength of someone who refused to let me vanish. That night on the highway had been the end of one life, but sitting on Margaret's porch, I realized it was also the beginning of another dot. Life with Aunt Margaret did not erase the scars, but it gave me a chance to begin again. The first thing she did was help me change my last name legally to Morgan, her maiden name, and the one my mother had tried so hard to bury. Signing those papers felt like slipping into a new skin, one that was mine alone. Emma Morgan. The name carried no chains, no echoes of Ethan's smirk or Donna's scorn. It was a declaration that I was not theirs anymore. Margaret's house was modest, a small cottage near the coast, painted a fading blue that smelled faintly of lemon polish and sea air. She worked mornings at the library and spent evenings knitting on the porch. She expected nothing from me but honesty and effort, a kind of love that asked for no performance. For the first few weeks, my body healed while my mind wrestled with ghosts. I woke in cold sweats, hearing Ethan's voice whispering, "You are nothing." Sometimes I jolted upright, convinced headlights were bearing down on me. Margaret never scolded when she found me trembling in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. She poured tea, sat beside me, and let silence do what words could not. But she also insisted I move forward. She took me to a diner by the pier and introduced me to the owner, Mrs. Carter, who agreed to give me morning shifts pouring coffee and wiping tables. The pay was meager, but it was cash in my pocket that no one could take away. Each dollar I earned felt like a brick in a foundation I was building for myself. At night, I enrolled in a community college nursing program. The tuition was modest compared to the university, but Margaret helped cover what my savings could not. She said, "Consider it an investment, not a gift. You are meant for something better." The routine became my lifeline. Dawn hours at the diner taught me to smile again, even if at first it was forced. Customers were kind regulars who tipped with a wink and told stories about fishing trips and grandchildren. The afternoons were spent in lectures learning about anatomy and patient care. I soaked up knowledge, hungrily determined that one day I would stand in a hospital, not as a victim, but as a nurse saving lives. Every step forward was shadowed by memories I refused to ignore. I began keeping a journal recording every detail of my family's abuse. I printed out the text messages Donna had sent, including the one from the highway night. I requested my medical records from the hospital, adding them to the file I labeled Simply Truth. I saved bank statements that showed withdrawals Ethan had made. Piece by piece, I was building a wall of evidence, not because I was ready to use it, but because I refused to let their version of the story erase mine again. Emotional undulation marked those months. There were mornings when sunlight over the ocean made me feel weightless, when laughter from the diner customers warmed me. And there were nights when I collapsed on my bed, shaking from memories that clawed at my chest. Healing was not linear. It was jagged like the scar across my forehead that never fully faded. But each stumble forward was still forward. Margaret reminded me often, "You do not have to be fearless. You just have to keep moving." Slowly, the thought that I had been nothing began to lose its grip. At the diner one afternoon, a customer asked my name. I answered Emma Morgan without hesitation. The sound of it filled me with quiet pride. I was no longer the extra mouth. I was a young woman building her own place in the world. On weekends, Margaret and I walked the shoreline, her hand steady on my shoulder as waves curled at our feet. She told me stories of her own battles with Donna, how she too had been called names, dismissed, erased. Her decision to leave had been painful, but necessary. She looked at me once with eyes shining and said, "You are the proof I was right to leave. If you had stayed in that house, you would not be here. You would be a ghost already." The words struck deep, a reminder that survival was not just luck. It was choice. And I had chosen, with Margaret's help, to step away from silence. By the end of that year, my file of truth was thick, my grades strong, my savings modest, but growing. The nightmares had not stopped, but they no longer dictated my every waking moment. I was learning to breathe without permission. I was learning to live. And though I did not yet know it all, the small bricks I was laying would one day become the fortress I needed when the past came roaring back into my life through the cruel lens of social media. For now, I focused on the sound of waves against the rocks, the clink of diner mugs, and the steady voice of Margaret reminding me every single day that I was no longer invisible. 5 years slipped by, marked not by grand events, but by the steady rhythm of survival and growth. I worked long shifts at the diner, studied late into the night, and built a quiet life under the name Emma Morgan. I kept my file of truth tucked safely in a locked drawer, adding to it whenever memories resurfaced or documents arrived in the mail. Most days I believed the past had lost its teeth. Then, one afternoon, while wiping down a table near the diner window, a friend from college sent me a message that shattered the fragile peace I had constructed. The link opened to a clip from a podcast, a low-budget show where men with too much beer and too little shame swapped stories about their youth. My breath froze as I recognized the voice. Ethan. My brother sat before a microphone, grinning with my father Harold, chuckling beside him. They were telling the world about the night they had abandoned me. Ethan leaned close to the mic, laughter spilling out of him. "Remember when we dumped Emma on the highway? Funniest night ever." The host laughed awkwardly, unsure, but Ethan pushed on, describing how I cried, how I crawled. He mocked my broken arm, imitating my voice, as if my pain had been a punchline. Harold added a comment about how dramatic I always was, and both of them roared with laughter. The bile rose in my throat. I pressed the phone away, but the words had already burned themselves into my ears. Within days, the clip exploded across TikTok and Reddit. Strangers shared it with captions filled with outrage. Comments poured in thousands of people declaring it was not a joke but an attempted murder. The hashtag Justice for Emma trended across platforms. Old classmates messaged me horrified. Some sent supportive notes, others asked if it was true. For the first time, the world seemed to see what I had endured. I should have felt vindicated, but the exposure cut deep. My privacy was gone, my wounds reopened for the entertainment of millions. I replayed the clip at night, fists clenched, listening to Ethan's voice, twisting my suffering into comedy. Yet, something unexpected happened as well. The weight of disbelief, the constant gaslighting I had carried all my life, began to crumble under the collective outrage of strangers. People I had never met believed me. They demanded accountability from men who had always walked away untouched. That shift shook me to my core. Margaret found me staring at my phone one evening, tears sliding silently down my face. She read the comments over my shoulder, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It is ugly," she said, "but it is also a gift. They confessed in public. You no longer need to prove what they did. They proved it themselves." I spent the next week in turmoil. Every time I stepped outside, I imagined eyes on me, whispers of recognition. The diner customers glanced at me differently once the clip hit the local news. Some offered quiet sympathy. Others avoided my gaze, uncomfortable with the story that had unfolded in their town. The pressure was suffocating, yet beneath it, a fire stirred. For years, I had kept my evidence locked away, afraid to speak, convinced no one would listen. Now the world was already listening. The shame was no longer mine to carry. It belonged to them. I opened the drawer where I kept the file of truth. I spread the documents across my bed. The medical records listing fractures and concussions. The bank statements showing money siphoned from my account. The text from Donna on the night of the highway incident. "Don't be dramatic. You always push him too far." The note Ethan once slid under my door. Each piece of paper whispered the same thing. "You were right. You always were." That night, I drafted an email to a local attorney known for handling family abuse cases. I attached to the documents the clip and a brief explanation. My finger hovered over the send button as my heart raced. For years, I had been silent. Silence had served them, not me. I clicked send. The response came quickly. The attorney wanted to meet. She said the evidence was damning, that the viral clip combined with medical records and written proof created a case that could not be ignored. She spoke of reckless endangerment, of financial abuse, of patterns of coercion. I listened numb but resolute. The case would be brutal, she warned, public and messy. My family would try to twist the narrative again. But this time, I would not be alone. This time, the world was already watching. As I left her office, the evening sun dipped into the ocean, painting the horizon gold. For the first time in years, I felt the possibility of justice like a tangible thing I could hold. My brother's laughter had once been my nightmare. Now it was his confession echoing across the internet for all to hear. The same arrogance that had left me bleeding on the highway had now opened the door to his downfall, and I intended to walk through it. The viral storm had barely begun to settle when the past showed up on my doorstep in the flesh. I was returning from a late shift at the diner, the salty wind from the ocean cooling my skin, when I saw a figure hunched on Aunt Margaret's porch. My heart slammed hard against my ribs as recognition cut through the dim light. Ethan. My brother looked nothing like the swaggering man from the podcast clip. His hair was greasy and unkempt, his eyes bloodshot with dark circles carved beneath them. His frame seemed smaller, his shoulders hunched as if the world had finally begun pressing back. When he lifted his head and saw me freeze at the edge of the walkway, his lips trembled. "Emma, please, you have to help me." His voice cracked thin and desperate. I stood rooted, torn between the instinct to flee and the fury boiling up inside me. The memory of asphalt scraping my skin of headlights fading as he laughed burned bright. I forced my voice steady. "You left me to die." His eyes widened, his body folding in on itself. He stammered, "I was stupid. I did not think it would get this far. The internet has destroyed me. People are threatening me. Please, you are the only one who can save me." My laugh was hollow. The internet had not destroyed him. His own arrogance had. For years he thrived on my silence. Now the world knew, and his collapse was not my burden. Aunt Margaret stepped outside, then her presence solid and unshakable. She stood behind me, not speaking, just letting the weight of her support press against my back. Ethan looked between us, panic flaring in his eyes. He whispered, "Mom and Dad will not even take my calls. They say I have ruined everything. I have nowhere else to go." My jaw clenched. That was the truth then. The family who once protected him had finally cast him aside because his cruelty no longer served them. It was never about love, only about power. I saw the fear in his eyes, but I also saw manipulation lurking beneath. The same old tactic dressed in desperation. He wanted me to feel guilty to carry him once more. But I was no longer the girl who begged for scraps of affection. I stepped closer, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You want help, Ethan? Then start by telling the truth. Tell them what you did. Tell them what you took from me." His lips tightened, a flash of defiance flickering before it collapsed into a sob. He dropped to his knees on the porch, shoulders shaking. "I cannot," he whispered. "If I admit it, I will lose everything." I felt cold clarity wash over me. "You already have." He reached toward me, but I stepped back. Margaret's hand settled lightly on my shoulder, grounding me. Ethan's sobs filled the night, but I felt no pity, only the sharp edge of justice drawing nearer. For the first time, I was not the one begging. He was, and I would not grant him the silence he craved. That night, I watched him stumble away into the darkness, his figure swallowed by the streetlights. I thought of how I had once been the one left on a road broken and alone. The symmetry was not lost on me. My fear had not vanished, but it no longer ruled me. The ghost of the highway had returned, but it found a woman who no longer bowed to it. The trial ahead would be brutal. Ethan's presence on my porch proved he knew it too. He had come seeking my mercy. All he had found was my resolve. Ethan did not disappear for long. A week later, he returned, this time in broad daylight, staggering up Aunt Margaret's walkway, as if he still had some claim to my time. I was sitting on the porch steps with a notebook in my lap, reviewing class notes, when his shadow fell across the pages. I looked up and saw the familiar tilt of his chin, though the arrogance that once fueled it had withered. His lips quivered as he whispered, "Emma, please hear me out." Aunt Margaret emerged from the kitchen window, eyes narrowed, watching but not interfering. This was my confrontation, my choice. I stood the notebook slipping closed in my hands. Ethan's eyes were glassy-rimmed red from sleepless nights. His voice cracked. "I cannot breathe. Everywhere I go, people point at me. They spit. They laugh. They say I tried to kill you." He stepped closer, hands outstretched in a mock gesture of surrender. I only wanted to scare you, Emma. I never meant to leave you like that. I stared at him, rage and clarity mingling sharp in my chest. My words cut clean. You did not abandon me once. You abandoned me my whole life. His face twisted as if I had struck him. He stammered, I was young stupid under pressure from Dad. You know how he is. I shook my head. You are 24 when you pushed me out of that car. Old enough to gamble, old enough to drink, old enough to know the difference between cruelty and brotherhood. He dropped to his knees on the wooden porch, clutching at the railing as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Tears spilled down his cheeks. I am sorry, Emma. Please, if you tell them you forgive me, maybe the world will calm down. My laugh came harsh cold. Forgiveness is not a tool for your convenience. Forgiveness does not erase what you did. He rocked back on his heels, eyes pleading. I have nothing left. Mom and Dad will not even answer my calls. They say I ruined everything that I shamed the family name. I snapped back. You shamed yourself. Do not drag me into your collapse. His sobs rose, desperate, ugly. He begged, I need you. Please do not let me go under alone. My silence stretched long, heavy as stone. Finally, I spoke, voice steady. You left me bleeding on the highway with nothing but broken bones and a text from Mom telling me I was dramatic. You thought I would die invisible, but I lived, and now the whole world sees you for what you are. His shoulders shook his forehead, pressing against the wood of the porch. I turned away, my back straight. Margaret stepped beside me, her presence warm and solid. Together we walked inside, leaving him crumpled outside like the broken remnant of the power he once wielded. Through the window, I watched him eventually stumble down the steps, his figure retreating. For years, I had been the one left behind, forced to gather the pieces alone. Now he was the one abandoned, sobbing in the dust. The symmetry was perfect. But unlike me, he still had choices. He could confess, he could face justice, or he could continue to beg for scraps of forgiveness he had never earned. The decision was his, but my silence would not protect him anymore. For the first time in my life, I had turned my back, not in defeat, but in defiance. And as the door shut between us, I realized this was not just survival. This was victory. The attorney moved quickly once she had the podcast clip the medical records in my stack of evidence. She told me it was rare to see a case with such clear admissions. Reckless endangerment, domestic violence, financial abuse, and a public confession all wrapped together. She warned me the trial would be exhausting and ugly, that my family would attempt to twist the narrative and paint me as unstable. I nodded, prepared for the storm. After years of silence, I was ready to speak. The courthouse steps were crowded the morning of the hearing. Reporters clustered near the entrance, their cameras flashing as I walked in with the attorney and Aunt Margaret at my side. For a moment, nerves clawed at me, but then I remembered the endless nights of fear, the scars that lined my skin, the laughter of Ethan echoing through the podcast. This was not about nerves, it was about truth. Inside, Ethan and Harold sat at the defense table. Donna perched in the back row, her eyes darting nervously from one reporter to another. Ethan's once proud shoulders were slumped, his suit wrinkled as though he had slept in it. Harold tried to maintain his stoic mask, but the twitch in his jaw betrayed him. The judge called the court to order. When the attorney played the podcast clip, the room fell silent. Ethan's voice filled the chamber, laughing, mocking, boasting about the night on the highway. Harold's chuckle followed, sealing the moment in damning clarity. Gasps rose from the gallery. Even the judge's face hardened as the words echoed. My attorney rose and called me to the stand. My legs trembled as I walked forward, but I held my head high. I swore the oath and sat the weight of the room pressing down on me. The questions began gently. I described the night, the argument over tuition money, the blows Ethan dealt, the shove that sent me sprawling onto the highway. I spoke of the text from Donna, the silence that followed the hospital bed where no family appeared. My voice wavered but did not break. Each sentence was another brick in the wall of truth I was building. The defense tried to interrupt, suggesting I exaggerated, that maybe I had misremembered. But my attorney presented the medical records, the fracture reports, the photographs of bruises taken at the hospital. She displayed the bank statements with Ethan's withdrawals highlighted. Finally, she held up the phone screenshot with Donna's words, "Don't be dramatic. You always push him too far." The jury stared at it, their expressions a mix of disbelief and disgust. When Ethan was called to speak, his arrogance had drained into desperation. He stammered, claiming it was a joke that he never intended to hurt me, that everyone was overreacting. But his voice cracked his eyes wild. The clip betrayed him more than my testimony ever could. The more he spoke, the deeper he dug his own grave. At one point, he stood shouting that I was ruining his life. The judge's gavel slammed, ordering him to sit. That was when his knees buckled and he collapsed against the defense table, his body racked with sobs. The courtroom buzzed, reporters scribbling furiously. I sat still, watching without pity. This was not my brother breaking down. This was justice catching up. Harold tried to defend him, mumbling about family loyalty, but his words sounded hollow, powerless. Donna shrank in the back row, her head bowed as though the shame she had refused to feel for decades had finally landed on her shoulders. When the verdict came, it was clear. Guilty. Ethan and Harold were sentenced to prison terms for reckless endangerment and financial abuse, their names forever stained in public record. Donna faced no prison, but the community turned its back. Neighbors whispered church members avoided her pew, her reputation shredded by the same silence she had once wielded as a weapon. As the bailiff led Ethan away in handcuffs, his face pale and broken, I remained seated calm. This was not revenge. This was the balance restored. I had waited years for someone to hear me. Now the world had listened. Walking out of the courthouse, the cameras flashed again, reporters calling my name. I did not answer. The only thing that mattered was the sunlight warming my face, the knowledge that the cycle of abuse had finally snapped. The girl who once lay bleeding on the highway had walked into court carrying nothing but the truth, and the truth had been enough. Dot. The trial ended, but the echoes of it lingered like smoke after a fire. For weeks I woke expecting another summons, another confrontation, another ambush of cruelty. Instead, there was only quiet, the kind of quiet that once felt suffocating but now tasted like air after drowning. Aunt Margaret and I sat on the porch the evening after the verdict, the sea stretching wide before us. She knit slowly, her hands steady, her presence grounding. "You did it," she said simply. I nodded, the weight of the words sinking deep. For the first time in years, I was not bracing for Ethan's laughter or Donna's cutting remarks. The silence was not their weapon anymore. It was my peace. Months passed and life began to settle into a rhythm again. I completed my nursing program, walking across the stage in a modest ceremony. The applause that followed was not thunderous, but it filled me with a sense of worth no taunt could erase. I pinned my badge to my uniform and knew I had built something no one could take. Margaret grew ill the following winter, a slow decline that left me spending long nights at her bedside. She never once complained. She only squeezed my hand and whispered, "You broke the cycle." That is all I ever wanted. When she passed, the loss struck deep, but she left me her house and a letter folded neatly on the dresser. It read, "Live without fear. Your freedom is my legacy." I clutched that letter as though it were armor. With Margaret gone, I faced the future alone, but not the way I had once been. I was not abandoned, I was equipped. I poured my energy into work-long shifts, caring for patients who reminded me daily that survival was never small. Each life touched reminded me of the night a stranger stopped his truck and chose to help. I decided to honor that choice. I established a small fund in Margaret's name, a scholarship for survivors of family abuse who wanted to pursue education. The donations came slowly at first, then grew after local news reported on my story again, framing it not as a tale of tragedy, but as a testament to endurance. Each letter I received from recipients of the scholarship felt like a thread weaving me into a larger fabric of resilience. Healing was not about forgetting, it was about transforming scars into tools. I still carried nightmares, but when Ethan's face haunted my sleep, I woke and reminded myself where he was, in prison, stripped of the power he had once wielded. Donna's name appeared occasionally in whispers through town, her presence shrinking under the weight of social rejection. She no longer had the platform to call me dramatic. Her voice no longer defined me. The greatest transformation was internal. I no longer avoided mirrors. The scar across my forehead was visible, but instead of shame, it spoke to me of survival. I told myself each morning, "You are not invisible anymore." On the anniversary of the trial, I stood by the shoreline, the wind whipping against my coat, and let the ocean carry away the remnants of fear. I thought of the highway, the red taillights fading, the asphalt biting into my skin. I thought of how certain I had been that I would die that night, And then I thought of this moment, breathing deep, standing tall, alive in every sense. Once I had been left to die as nothing. Now I stood as proof that even the most toxic roots could not choke out the will to rise. Justice had come late but undeniable. My family's betrayal had marked me, but it had not defined me. What defined me was the choice to live, to speak, to build. The cycle ended with me, and in its place grew something stronger than silence. It grew me. If you have listened to my story this far, you know it was never just about one night on a highway. It was about years of being silenced, gaslighted, and erased until my brother's shove and my mother's text made it clear that I was considered nothing. For too long, I carried that lie, believing their cruelty defined my worth. But the truth is clear now. Family can wound as deeply as any stranger, and sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones you need to protect yourself from. I am telling this not because I crave sympathy, but because I know someone listening might recognize themselves in my words. Maybe you too have been called dramatic when you were only desperate to be heard. Maybe you too were told that loyalty meant silence while someone else thrived off your pain. I want you to know this silence only serves them. Breaking it is what will save you. The road to justice was long, painful, and public. I will not lie to you and say it was easy. Facing my abuser in court, reliving the night I thought would be my last, and watching my family deny me again was not a victory lap. It was grueling, but when the gavel came down and the truth was recorded for all to see, something inside me shifted forever. I was no longer invisible. The courtroom gave me what my family never did: acknowledgement. If you are older, maybe in your 50s or 60s, perhaps you carry stories like mine tucked away because you think it is too late or too messy. Let me remind you that it is never too late for truth. It is never too late for justice. And even if the law cannot reach every corner of your pain, telling your story can still break the cycle for the ones who come after you. So I ask you, as someone who stood on that highway bleeding and later stood in that courtroom unbroken, to think about your own life. Have you been silenced? Have you been told you were nothing? If so, I invite you to share in the comments. Let your voice join mine, because every story added makes the silence weaker. And if my story has stirred something in you, do not leave without subscribing. This channel is a place where stories like ours are told honestly, where justice is not just a word, but a demand. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it. Help spread the reminder that toxic families do not get the last word. We do. I was left bleeding on a highway and told I was nothing. Today, I stand in the light, not just surviving, but thriving. And I want you to stand with me. Because the greatest justice is not only what happens in court, it is what happens when we refuse to disappear.